Chapter 8. Kitty gasped. Of course, I did see what Daisy meant. Miss Alston had been odder than ever since Mr. Curtis arrived. I remembered the moment when she had emerged from the maze and he had spoken to her in that strange way, as though he knew something about her that we did not. But all the same, I was concerned. I remembered what had happened the last time Daisy decided on a suspect so quickly. Are you sure? I asked. Daisy rolled her eyes. No, I'm not sure, she said. It's just a hypothesis, but you have to admit it's a good one. We heard what Mr. Curtis said to her. He accused her of being at Fanningford for a reason other than being a governess, and I'm sure that's true. She's a very suspicious character. I'm certain she has a secret. It's extremely important that we watch her and try to discover what it is. Write it down on the list. Now, who else? I didn't want to be the first to mention someone from Daisy's family. I opened my mouth and shut it again. But then Kitty spoke. What about your Aunt Saskia? She said. You said that watch of Mr. Curtis's was missing with the teacup. Hasn't she been absolutely fixated on it all weekend? She might have murdered Mr. Curtis to get her hands on it, and she didn't want your mother to call the police. Daisy blinked and frowned. I'm only saying, said Kitty, undaunted. You asked who else might have done it. Yes, said Daisy, you're quite right, of course. We know that the watch is missing, and we also know that Aunt Saskia is always taking things that don't belong to her. She's not a thief. People like us aren't, but she does have a little problem. She's only ever taken small things that won't be missed, but I suppose that if she wanted the watch enough, she might have done something silly to get it. Write that down too, Hazel. And what about Uncle Felix? I put in, since the plunge had clearly been taken. I know you like him, but you have to admit that he's been behaving strangely too. Why did he lie about Mr. Curtis being poisoned? We overheard him asking about the doctor to take samples and send them to London, so we know he thinks it's suspicious. And remember that conversation we overheard in the maze? He was telling Mr. Curtis that if he didn't leave, he'd do something awful to him. What if the murder was what he meant? He wouldn't, said Daisy heatedly. You don't know Uncle Felix. Because you won't tell us about him, I said. Are those rumours about him true? Daisy flushed. I shan't tell you, she said at last. I had a feeling she really meant I don't know. But all right, you can put him down on your list for now, but I'll rule him out, you'll see. Chapter 9. At that moment the door opened and Bertie came in, with Stephen just behind him. Bertie was tinkering away at his ukulele again. It had gone flat in the damp and was letting out sour, off-tune notes. Bertie looked just as angry as he always did, and I wondered about him as a suspect. He did get into such horrible rages, and he knew about Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings. Daisy wrinkled up her nose at him. Go away, she said. We're busy. What are you playing? Anyway. The funeral march, said Bertie, strumming obnoxiously. And I might ask the same thing of you, Squashy. What are you all playing at? Daisy glared. A game, she said. You wouldn't be interested. Bertie narrowed his eyes, looking as he did so exactly like Daisy sometimes does. I couldn't decide whether it was funny or creepy. I know all your secrets, Squashy, he said. I'm only lucky that you don't know all mine. Why, snapped Daisy, what have you done now? Well, despite what Mother says, I didn't kill Mr. Curtis, said Bertie. In fact, I don't believe anyone did. Do you, Stephen? Stephen went pale. I don't know, he said. I could tell that he hated the discussion. I felt quite sorry for him. You see, said Bertie, he thinks it's a stupid question. Honestly, how did Mother get that idea in her head? I know she's a bit silly sometimes, but this is something else. Mummy can be an idiot, said Daisy. I expect she simply misheard Dr. Cooper. Bertie snorted, and even Stephen grinned. Now go away, Daisy repeated, or we'll make you play dolls with us. Horror, said Bertie, and he made the ukulele jangle in pain. I caught Stephen's eye. His freckles were standing out more than ever, but he gave me a smile, and I felt better at once. Stephen was bearing up, and I could too. All right, said Daisy when they had gone. Thank goodness we don't really have to play dolls. Back to our suspect list. Who else can we put down? I know who we can rule out. If we're saying that the poison must have been given to Mr. Curtis at tea, it means that the murderer must have been in the dining room itself when tea was served, to drop the poison into his teacup. It can't have been in the pot after all. Hetty and Mrs. Doherty weren't there, so they can be ruled out at once. I'm glad about that. Oh, and I say, don't you remember how far Mummy made Chapman stand from the tea table? He never went near it. He couldn't have doctored Mr. Curtis's cup. He's out too. I had suddenly thought of something. How do you think the murderer got the poison into the cup from the tin? He asked. Perhaps they wrapped it up in their handkerchief or a bit of paper. I've read about that in a book, said Daisy. Then they tipped it into Mr. Curtis's cup when no one was looking. I put my hand in my pocket and pulled out the paper I had found on the dining room table the night before. A bit of paper like this? I asked. I found it in the dining room last night, but I didn't think. I forgot with all the excitement about the cup. Hazel, Daisy gasped. You clever thing. A clue, a real clue. All four of us bent over it. It really was half a page from a book, the words close printed. There was a little smear of pale powder on one edge, and when I saw that, I knew that there could be no doubt. This was what the murderer had used to keep the poison in. We read the text. Struck again, and growing still in stature the grim shape, towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with a purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me, with trembling. Rubbishy poetry, said Daisy. I don't blame the murderer for tearing it up, but this is still very good. We must be on the lookout for the book this came from. It's an important step forward with the investigation. All right, let's continue our suspects. Who else is there? Lord Hastings, I said, because someone had to. He knew about your mother and Mr. Curtis. He might have wanted to take revenge. After all, we saw him get cross at Mr. Curtis yesterday morning. We saw him tell Mr. Curtis to leave, said Daisy, and he knew that Mr. Curtis was going to the station yesterday. Why would he kill him after that? But Daisy, I said, he did shout at him. We all heard. Yes, I do admit that we can't rule him out, she said sharply. He was at the tea table at the right time, and he did have a reason to hate Mr. Curtis. All right, put him down for the moment. Oh, and I know, she added, dropping Lord Hastings out of the discussion as if he were a hot coal in her hand. What about Bertie? We must add him to the list. It'll make him fearfully cross. He does get so angry sometimes. I wouldn't be surprised if he was secretly a homicidal maniac. Can't you imagine him bumping off Mr. Curtis? Do you really believe that? Asked Beanie. Of course I don't, said Daisy. He's my brother. But we're adding everyone to the list, aren't we? We might as well suspect them all while we're at it. So, Daddy, Bertie, who else? Oh, yes, Stephen. What motive does he have? I could feel my cheeks going pink. He doesn't know about Mr. Curtis, does he? And he can't be angry about Lady Hastings. Ooh, said Kitty. Hazel's fond of Stephen. Daisy looked at me, and my face heated up even more. I couldn't help it. Bertie's told me a bit about Stephen's past, she said. His father's dead and his mother's terribly poor. What if he killed Mr. Curtis to steal the watch and sell it? How tragic, said Kitty gleefully. Poor Stephen, said Beanie. I'd say the money angle's not a bad one. Write it down, Hazel. I did, and then I said, one person left. What about Lady Hastings? It was quite cruel of me, I know, but after what Daisy had just said, I wanted to jab at her. But I thought you said she liked Mr. Curtis, Beanie asked shyly. Why would she kill someone she liked? But I saw her arguing with Mr. Curtis yesterday afternoon, I said, reluctant to tell Daisy what I'd seen, but knowing that I had no choice now. He wanted her to run away with him and bring her jewels and a painting, and she wouldn't, and Mr. Curtis was angry. He said he was going to tell Lord Hastings. What if she killed him to stop him doing that? Daisy frowned. You ought to have told me that at once, she said. That's important information. But all the same, Mummy isn't really clever enough to plan something like dropping poison in a cup. I'm sure that if she tried, someone would notice immediately. However, what you saw means that we can't rule her out as yet. She can go down on the list for the moment. Suspect list. 1. Miss Alston. Motive? Unknown. But we suspect that she has some sort of secret history which Mr. Curtis knows about. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. Notes. Was seen being threatened by Mr. Curtis outside the maze by Daisy Wells and Hazel Wong. Who is she really, and what is she doing here? We must investigate. 2. Aunt Saskia. Motive. Wanted Mr. Curtis's watch. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. Notes. Has been behaving suspiciously, does not want the police to get involved, although this could be because of other misdemeanours in her past. Search her room for the watch. 3. Uncle Felix. Motive. Rage at Mr. Curtis over Lady Hastings. He was heard in the maze threatening Mr. Curtis by Daisy Wells and Hazel Wong. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen poison from the hall. Notes. We know that he has lied about Mr. Curtis's cause of death. Why? 4. Lord Hastings. Motive. Jealousy. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. Notes. Seen shouting at Mr. Curtis on Saturday morning and telling him to leave Fallingford. 5. Bertie Alston. Motive. Rage at Mr. Curtis over Lady Hastings. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. 6. Stephen Bampton. Motive. He's not well off. Could he have stolen Mr. Curtis's watch to sell it? Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. 7. Lady Hastings. Motive. Mr. Curtis threatened her. She might have killed him to stop him carrying out his threat. Opportunity. Was at the tea table at the crucial time, could have stolen the poison from the hall. All right, said Daisy. I think that wraps up the meeting. So what are we going to do now? Beanie asked. Gather evidence, of course. We need to investigate each of our suspects. For example, we must see if we can uncover something about Miss Alston's past. Can we discover her letter of reference? She must have one. We could look in her room. Perhaps she keeps her papers there. Then there's the piece of paper Hazel found. Which book did it come from? And we ought to conduct interviews with Chapman, Mrs. Doherty and Hetty. We know they didn't do it, but servants' evidence is usually the most crucial. As detectives, we'd be fools to leave them out. With any luck, we'll be able to wrap up the case before the police arrive. I felt the same old detective excitement rising up in me. Daisy was getting to me, turning real things into puzzles to be solved. But then I wondered whether it wasn't better to think of Mr. Curtis as a puzzle rather than a real person who had been murdered. When I thought about all that, I felt filled with awfulness, not excited at all. Where do we start? Asked Kitty. Detective fever seemed to have infected her too. Her eyes were shining as she shook her hair back from her forehead. Miss Alston's bedroom, said Daisy, since she's downstairs with the other grown-ups. At the moment, she seems the most likely culprit, but we need to learn more about her. We can look for her papers and the teacup and watch into the bargain. See you next time.